we will turn it open to the committee now for some conversation with you. Perhaps I could lead off the discussion here. And by the way, could we maybe take that slide down for a moment, and so I can see the all of the committee members. Brian, if you were to call out the 1, 2, or 3 biggest issues that you think need to be addressed or that you would like to see come out of the committee's deliberations, what might those be?
That's a good question. So I think that we are really coming to terms with the growth of the national system, particularly as we become less and less dependent upon geography. Some folks have described the purple changes as being in favor of certain parts of the country, when in fact what they are is making geography less important and taking away some previous, probably unintentional geographic advantages in the country. So as we become closer and closer to a humanly national system, and as the volumes go higher and higher, we're evolving from a system that has always depended on sort of the immediate decisions in the moment by highly competent individuals. And that's not going to change. But we can't leave all of the decisions, no matter how smart the individuals are and how experienced and how well trained, when we have to start moving some of the decisions upstream. So some of the things we're working on are applying filters based on transplant centers' previous behavior, employing behavioral science to determine whether centers are likely to accept an offer before it's made. And so I think that one of the issues is certainly what are the boundaries around those tools? How far should the system go in predicting whether someone will take a transplant? If every hospital, every clinician looks at every offer every time, the system will bog down. But if the system were to decide for the clinician, this is your organ and you must take it, that's not a system any of us are comfortable with. So where are the boundaries in that? And I think that's something we're only beginning to explore. I think related to that then is how do we inform patients and have them have intelligent, well-informed conversations with their clinicians about their priorities. I think that some of the unused organs that were available for donation might fit some patients and might actually address their priorities. Some patients might choose to have a transplant with a shorter wait, even if it is less of a long-term outcome. Some patients might want to wait longer for an organ that will last them longer. How do we have those conversations with patients? What is their role in that? And how do we make sure that all of the potential value from the generous organ donors in our community is actually put to use? I think those are two areas that are really important for where the field goes next.
And do you see this continuing to be basically a person-to-person conversation or something that would be aided by augmented intelligence or some other technical means?
Well, I think that's, we've created, kidney is essentially a waiting time-based system. The other organs are all urgency-based systems. And so I don't think there's much angst over whether to wait for the better organ, quite so much in the other organs. But kidney, because it's a wait time-based system, we've almost created a bubble of surplus in the midst of this national shortage, because a kidney patient who turns down one kidney, they're at the top of the list primarily based on their waiting time, is likely to get another kidney offer. So figuring out how to offer only those kidneys that are likely to be taken by those patients who have waited longest to them, and going straight to the patients more likely to take another kidney offer without having to go all the way down the list, which creates cold time, which is a real issue, which also creates sort of groupthink, which is not a clinical issue, but makes it harder and harder to place organs that aren't accepted by the first few candidates.
Let me turn it over to the committee. Questions, comments?
Alex has his hand raised.
Okay, Alex.
Thank you very much, Brian. I had a couple of questions as to how the OPTN has understood the requirements of the final rule. One of the requirements is that the policies for allocation, as you noted on your slide, make the best use of the donated organ. And it seems to me that that term best sums up the difficulties that we face here because of the different possible measurements of what should be valued and accumulated. You showed some data, for example, on the liver and recounted several different things. Have you elaborated? Do you have a document that would help to explain how all of the expert committees bringing medical judgment to the matter of the rules, and that's the first criterion set forth by the final rule for the allocation rules, how they have understood what best is? And just to finish the comment, also listed later on is avoid futile transplants. And again, the word futile could cover a range of outcomes from dying on the table with a certainty to different degrees of risk to different lengths of survival. Is a transplant futile if a person never leaves the hospital, if they leave but die within a week, if they die within a month, or whatever, et cetera, et cetera. So what other kinds of things go into best use?
Sure. I think you'll find there's probably no single place. There's no one definition, and you've illustrated sort of some of the challenges of doing that. But the OPTN again is the donation and transplant community, and so we convene and serve that population. But the decisions these are community decisions. So I think that not only is there not one definition, but that the definition evolves over time. It changes as clinical improvements change. It changes as populations may change their priorities over time. I think the best documentation of that would come from the OPTN ethics white paper, although I'll tell you that that's broad. And then I would say look at individual policy proposals, and we can certainly you can find those on the OPTN website. We can certainly forward some of them to you, and you can look at those to see how each committee has wrestled with best use versus justice and equity issues and autonomy issues, sort of all at the same time. There isn't a formula that does that. If you look at continuous distribution, the way that the lung committee came up with the coefficients for their draft proposal is they went through a process where they actually had lots and lots of different characteristics sort of side by side and just repeatedly, all things being equal, which of these two things is more important on a scale of 1 to 5, and then another one, and then another one, and then another one, and ultimately tried to calculate a formula that represented the sum total of all those decisions. So best is certainly a values term and not simply a clinical one, and it is an ongoing conversation and not a single definition.
I guess the committee can discuss how we might seek some further elaboration. We have now more than 20 years experience with the OPTN interpreting and operating under the final rule. And I guess it would be good, and perhaps, as you pointed out, Dr. Gordon has chaired the ethics committee and she's a member of our committee. We can look to her. But I mean, one question would be, does BEST take into account fairness? That you would say an allocation that meets, does a better job of meeting the equitable distribution is better and therefore could be the best, even if it had medical outcomes that were less favorable. There was one term that was used in that lung slide that I just didn't understand what was encompassed. If you could explain what the committee was thinking of. Placement efficiency. What are the inputs that are being measured there?
So placement efficiency is largely a calculation of how far the organ needs to travel and how they will. There's also, I will send a link to Rebecca to share with you that walks through just really a lot of detail on how continuous distribution would work, and what the lung committee is the first committee to sort of tackle this method of policy development. But that way you can dive into that to your heart's content. But placement efficiency really is about getting through the process, getting the organ to someone who will take it, and then actually delivering the organ and making sure that it's transplanted there. Obviously, the time that an organ spends cold is a critical issue in planning the recovery and transplant of an organ. It is. It may not be forever. Perfusion devices are certainly going to change that formula and may eliminate it completely in the future. And maybe at that point, it's simply a matter of whether the cost of moving an organ is worth going to a certain place or not. But placement efficiency is about that sort of logistical consideration that, at least at this point in time, it still matters. You can only go so far before you are not able to use that organ, and you've resulted in a theoretically fairer system that doesn't take advantage of the transplant. And so that's even the circles that we've adopted, which we think are a more rational use of geography. They are still geography dependent and still intended to reduce unnecessary cold time.
Thank you.
Dr. Sloggy?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Is there anything in the policy, the current allocation rule, that allows experimentation? Because any idea has to go through all this circle, and what makes an idea something that we can experiment rather than locally or regionally or so forth. I think this is one of the bottlenecks is the speed of changing and experimenting and so forth. And once some policy is adopted, you change the entire system, but you never experimented with it. You experimented it in simulations and so forth. So I wonder if there's have you seen or some kind of local experiments? I know OPOs, for example, experiment a little bit, but not a lot within the rules.
Sure. I think the policies have always allowed for variances, and so a variance is actually specifically called for in the regulation, and it allows for a local area or a certain group of hospitals or OPOs to apply a different policy or at least a different wrinkle on that policy, just in their area for a limited period of time with some specific metrics and data. They used to be much more common. There are only really a couple right now, and they're Hawaii related, which is more of a permanent difference than an experiment. But that pathway exists in the policy. Again, that's, the allocation policy doesn't preclude clinical experimentation or even logistical and other, therapeutic experimentation, but there is that avenue in policy for policy experimentation as well.
Ken, I just wanted to note that we have Neil and Jim and Dennis with their hands up.
All right, so why don't we go in that order, Neil?
Yeah, so I want to follow up, I think, on Alexander's thing. When I was looking at, saw the principles for the allocation, I did not see equity on that slide. But then you went on to say that the ethics group, considers that. So that if I got that right, that just struck me. One of the things also that I just wanted to see if you all had addressed in the past is, for kidney transplant waitlisting, the issue of using this threshold of a GFR less than 20, may not be equitable. It may be equal, but it may not be equitable. And I'm thinking from the point of view of racial minorities who progress faster to ESRD. And so their time, is short from when they develop kidney disease to when they develop ESRD. And whether models of equity that might be based on risk rather than a arbitrary set threshold may be a better way of assuring more equitable allocation. I just wanted to know if those issues have been discussed. It also comes up in the context of this issue about using race in EGFR. So.
Right, and to clarify, the OPTN doesn't calculate GFR and but does not prohibit centers from calculating it in the way that they feel is clinically appropriate. We are actually studying that issue, and we're not the only ones to determine whether a better way of calculating EGFR and whether we should insist on a certain calculation would be appropriate for policy. I do think that the kidney list has long been a time-based list as opposed to the others, which are urgency-based. And I think as the science can help us define a difference in urgency other than simply the days since the beginning of dialysis, that's something that we would be able to work into that into the kidney policy in a way more similar to the way it has been in other organs. And I will say, we know that not all candidates are referred to the wait list in the same way or have the same access to transplant. And again, the wait list can only help those folks once they have gotten to a transplant hospital and been determined to be candidates. But we made some changes in the kidney policy just a few years ago, for example, to make the wait time begin at the initiation of dialysis, not at the point at which they get to the hospital. So if they have suffered a delay in getting to the point of getting on the wait list, that was not a disadvantage to those candidates.
Does that answer your question, Neil?
Yes, I was interested in that. Thanks.
All right, Jim?
Brian, this is Jim Young. It's a really nice overview that you had given. Many of us here have been in organ transplantation for 3-4 decades, and there's been a rather dramatic evolution that has occurred. And so back in the early 80s, for example, before NOTA, before a lot of governmental oversight, if you will, some would call it intervention, if you will, there's been massive amount of change occur. There are still some issues with domineering personalities, domineering programs. And when I was sitting on the boards for the AST and ISHLT, et cetera, a couple decades ago, this was a really big issue with driving policy. Today, I think things have evolved and changed, but quick question, and I want to follow it up with another quick question. On a 1 to 5 Likert scale, with 5 being 1980 and real problems with domineering programs, domineering personalities trying to influence things versus today, where would you sit on that Likert scale?
So I think that we try to balance hard data with community input. And so as long as you value community input, you run the risk of some of the personality-driven decision-making. And so our challenge is to hear from a large number of people. And so that's why the nominating committee has changed a lot of recent processes. I don't think you see board presidents or board members from the same 5 institutions all the time, or from the same sort of usual suspects. We've tried to do a good job of being creating a diverse board in lots of different ways, and I think that possibility exists. I think the folks who advocate to us, like the societies, like ASTS and others, the possibility certainly exists in those organizations as well. But we don't want to rule out community input. So our goal is to get as much community input we have now in the last regional meeting cycle, 90% of all the transplant hospitals or OPOs send at least one person to a regional meeting in their area. And so what we want is more input, rather than try to just avoid maybe the loudest voices. Just make sure we have added all the other voices to that. That's sort of an ongoing challenge and one we recognize, but we still think it's not enough just to put data in front of 1 or 2 people and let them make some perfect decision. There isn't a perfect decision, because as well as data judgments. And so our challenge is to get everybody to the table and not just a few loud voices.
Well, I think you're doing a good job on that one. So I'll give you a 1.5 to 2 on that Likert scale, okay? Now, another quick question is it was fascinating to me when I heard Dr. Odom's presentation about how NIH got involved with the NAMS issue, because there was an open contract there, and the open contract was the organ donor intervention National Academy of Medicine report that came out published in 2017. There were some specific recommendations in there about handling and moving research in organ donors and with deceased donors and whatnot. How has OPTN UNOS reacted to those recommendations, if there's been any reaction to it at all? I'm just curious to see if there was an impact on that particular report. And that's all I have for questions.
Yeah, I think the impact of that report is still kind of moving through the system, and we are not the first organization that would be impacted by those recommendations. I think the way that OPOs work, the way that they look to interventions that would potentially increase donations, the way they get approval for studies, which is not in our bailiwick, will be affected by those recommendations before it gets to us. I think the OPTN role in some of those is more of a coordinating and information sharing, and then adjusting to the findings of those kinds of experiments, not specifically the report from the NAS committee itself.
Rebecca, Oh, go ahead, Dr. Odom.
I was just going to piggyback on what Brian said. My last touching basis with where things are is that the recommendations went over to the Office of Human Research Protections to look for ways of perhaps getting a waiver of consent. And my understanding is that it's pretty close to reaching that goal. And I don't know whether they have announced their deliberation, but it went to an advisory committee evaluating the consent issues for the donor or on the donor side.
Good
So
to
it
hear.
is a slow process, but I think it's moving.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Rebecca, I forget who was next.
Dennis.
Dennis, okay, that's.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just say, first of all, Brian, I'm always impressed with your work and the work of such a challenging and complex area, and you just do it day after day and do it well. And I just want to thank you for that. One comment and two questions. The first comment is I thought that your answer to Dr. Kaiser's question about the top things that you see on the list as needing to be addressed, I thought was very insightful. In particular, the business about sort of informing patients about the options that they have with organ allocation and having sort of robust interaction with patients around those decisions, I think is a critically important thing. So I wanted to thank you for your answer on that. The two questions that I have, the first one is, in the slide that you showed, and you kind of talked about wanting to come back to the match, multiple times, but, kind of the very clear slide that you had that showed the processes of both donation and getting listed, and then kind of once you are listed, how the transplant occurs and so on. There's these two parts to it that say, make the organ offer and then the organ acceptance. And the idea there is singular, like an offer. It doesn't say organ offers, it says organ offer. And kind of in my mind, when I first kind of got connected to this field, 15 years or so ago, I kind of had it in my head that, there's this list and it's got maybe a dozen patients on it, and you progress from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 over time in making the offer. And that it's kind of single digits or maybe 10 or 12. But I believe that in the case of kidneys, at least, that there are many situations where the numbers of offers that are made for a single kidney might be over 100. Is that correct? Or could you comment about that? Like what are the numbers of offers that occur with some of these organs? Can you comment on that at all?
Sure. Kidney certainly is the organ that by far could end up with the most offers, and you have a number of kidney surgeons on the committee here as well. While most offers, most of the organs, at least a majority, just more than 50%, are accepted in the first handful of offers, certainly in the single digits. If they are not, then the number of offers can start to get very high very quickly. I can get you a document that sort of gives you some hard numbers on that. But you're absolutely right. If organs are not taken in the first couple of offers, they can really start to get they can really start to move down the list. Partly, I think, because if they aren't taken in the first few, it's because the organ is less than ideal, maybe. But also partly, and some of our research shows some effect of this, is that once an organ has come way down the list, the reviewers of those offers tend to think there must be something in that organ that makes it less desirable. Even if there's not something clinical, just actually the sequence number, the offer number, can affect people's decision making. And so that type of behavioral science is something we're really just starting to look into and get our hands around, and whether the offer number really is a clinical piece of information people should have, or whether that's whether that's actually driving people to do other things. Now, if we didn't offer, say, an older donor to that patient that has been waiting for a long time and is near the top of the list and is is likely to get a younger potential donor later. If we didn't make that offer to people that we know aren't going to take it, maybe we wouldn't have that phenomenon at all. We could go straight to somewhere in the middle of the list, somewhere further down that people might be ready to take that kind of offer. And I should clarify for some of you, there's not one list. The list is generated every time there's an organ to be donated. So it depends on the specific donor characteristics. It depends on the location of the donor. It depends on the candidate characteristics, as they may change over time as they get new lab values, as they get more waiting time, things like that. So you're not fifth on the list today, and if you wait till tomorrow, you'll be fourth. Especially in the urgency-based organs, a more urgent patient could emerge, immediately. And so there is a database. When there's an organ to be offered, then there is a list for that organ, and that list changes.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. I'd like to just take you up on the offer you made there to send the data, around these numbers and what that looks like. I think that would be very helpful to see. The second question is sort of closely related to the first one. When I first sort of became acquainted with the extensive number of discards, or excuse me, I want to correct my language there. The numbers of kidneys that are not being used, on the order of 20% or so. My impression was that if 20% of kidneys that are becoming available for transplant are not used, that the ones that are not used are sort of the least desirable kidneys. In other words, if there's 100 kidneys, we use the 80 best ones, and then the 20 that aren't used are in this other category. But I've seen data over the course of the last 18 months that shows a large number of the kidneys that are not being used are in many cases kidneys with lower KDPIs that really are pretty good. And I just wonder if you could comment on that briefly, and whether that's related to this phenomena of, if you're sort of making a decision about whether to accept a kidney for a patient, and that, okay, because they're now at the point where they're getting offers, if I just wait, I'll get a better one, so I'll keep waiting for this better one. And then meanwhile, we drive all these kidneys way down the list, and they develop sort of this bad reputation that you were talking about earlier. Could you comment about the quality of the organs that we're currently not using? I'm thinking particularly kidneys, but I'd welcome any insight that you might have on the other organ types.
Sure, and there's a curve, right? So there's not a point at which suddenly none of them are taken anymore, but there is a curve of predicted acceptance that fits with the quality of the kidney, and there's a pretty sharp downturn. And I'll send you some slides and some research that our team has done. And as you get sort of higher and higher KDPIs, the chances of that higher and higher KDPI is a lesser quality kidney. The chances of that kidney being accepted for transplant get lower and lower. But certainly, some of those kidneys would provide some benefit. Maybe they wouldn't provide as much benefit as some other kidneys, but they are probably, many of those kidneys are the right kidney for someone. And if we could be more specific in our offer making and say, we know this is not the right kidney for this part of the list. Perhaps it is the right kidney for one of this group instead, and go straight to them. Then we don't get the groupthink, we don't get the cold time, which is certainly a very real clinical factor. And maybe we can more immediately get to that, and that kind of decision making has to be based on those patient conversations. So am I the patient who wants to be at a child's wedding or graduation this summer, and if it's a 5-year kidney and not a 10-year kidney, that's what I need for me? Or am I the patient that wants to wait on dialysis for as long as it takes to get one transplant and never have to think about it again? Who am I, and what is right for me in my in the life that I'm trying to lead? And that's getting the right tools and the right data to have those kind of conversations with patients, and then be able to find the right patient, the right organ at the right time is really critical to where we're going. But there's certainly certainly, I think some value that is not being fully utilized. Now that said, OPOs ought to recover or at least offer more organs than are actually accepted. If every single organ is being accepted, it probably means the OPOs were not being aggressive enough or pushing the boundary far enough. So you want them to be a little further out than the centers, but I think at the 20% number there is value. There's value there to be had.
Yeah, I would welcome you. Did mention again that your team has done research on the quality of the kidneys that are not used, and I again would welcome if that's information you could provide to the committee.
Dr. Odom, you look like you wanted to make a comment.
I was going to ask of the experts in this group whether there are models of allocation, perhaps elsewhere, where you allocate in batches and not necessarily sequential, to try and preserve some of that cold ischemia time. So you allocate to 20 patients or 30 patients, and there's a hierarchy, and the clock starts ticking at that allocation point, such that if the first person turns it down, the second, somebody in that scheme will accept it, so that you can actually fast forward and move quickly with the allocation process.
Yeah, we've actually published on that and have been proposing this for years. So hopefully this is something we'll discuss as a committee as well.
Okay. Thanks, Dory.
That it happens to some extent, and it doesn't. One of the limitations on that is the desire from the transplant hospitals not to get large numbers of offers that they then are not really offered because someone ahead of them has taken them, and that sort of push and pull will continue to exist as long as every center sort of has a broad, maybe unnecessarily broad view of what they might take. And the more, if we can encourage centers to be more specific in what they might take, then the number of offers they get goes down, which means the number of people that we can reach at one time who are serious considerations for this organ would go up. We can, a lot of these problems are really interconnected and are a result of, increasing volumes.
This is Kevin. I was just going to say, as Dr. Segev and Dr. Odom and others, the classic example of kidneys that aren't used that are otherwise of good quality are hepatitis C infected kidneys, which of course is a special case. It kind of makes the case that many of these are not necessarily one single cause, although the leading specified cause, as you pointed out, is too much time elapsed and too much cold time is accumulated in kind of this groupthink. And that's actually the leading specified cause for not utilizing kidneys.
Yeah. Dr. Slaughter, you had your hand up?
Yeah, OPOs some of them have been offering in batches in order to cut times, but it still follows the rules that, if I understand correctly, the first one, they get some amount of time, and the first one that's the one with the highest priority that says yes during that time still gets priority. But yeah, there's a lot of ways to think about breaking this. One thing, if I understand correctly, OPOs can also skip at some point the priorities or the list once they see there's a risk. Is that correct?
So it is. OPOs are tasked with finding a recipient for an organ, and so they are occasionally. You get to a point where the organ is not going to be able to be placed unless they find someone immediately, and usually that's nearby. Those are reviewed by our peer review committee, and so if it looks like an OPO has done that on a few occasions because of emergencies, then the committee can take that into account. If a pattern develops where it appears that that's an excuse to go to a certain hospital or something, our committee would see that as well. There is sort of some implementational flexibility, but it's pretty limited and not really the way that most organs are transplanted.
Dennis, were your questions answered adequately?
Yeah, I think I look forward to the data that Brian is willing to share, but absolutely, yeah, I appreciate the answers.
All right. Rebecca, who else has their hand up?
We have no more hands up that I can see.
So while we, let me just call on the committee. And any other questions or comments at this point?
And there's one thing I'll mention, and the committee might help us with this as well, because it's come up a couple of times about the speed of policy development. Most new policies take 1 or 2 cycles, which is these are 6-month cycles in the way we sort of think about the board and committees. Bigger policies like a substantial geography overhaul could take longer than that. A major shift in say the kidney allocation system of 2014, which dealt with sensitization and with waiting time and dialysis and a number of issues all at the same time. Those can take multiple years. And it comes back to my discussion with Dr. Young a few minutes ago about community involvement and input. And so we can be faster if we don't stop to listen to what people think. We can listen to what more people think if we take more time. And so if the committee has guidance on how to determine whether we're getting the balance right, how do we know that we've gone too fast and not heard from enough people, or how do we know that we have waited too long and that we should have implemented something earlier? We tend to work towards consensus, and because faith in the system is really important, because all of this is built on the goodwill of American citizens who participate. But that's a constant push and pull. And so if the committee wanted to weigh in on how to determine the relative balance between input and speed, because we have, I think, in recent years ironed out most of the any sort of procedural slowdowns or challenges, and the IT system is quick to upgrade and adopt the new policies. So really the factor that keeps policy from being fast is having people's input. And so how we balance that is a critical part of the work we do.
Charles, you have a question.
Yes, following up on what you were saying there, exactly relating to the speed at which policy has been changed. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the 35 years that have passed between the time NOTA was passed and the OPTN was created, and in a few days we'll have the final acuity circle. Could you comment on to what extent perhaps local primacy has had on the time that took? I understand a lot of it was preservation advances that we had to wait on, but specifically how UNOS's sort of policy of local primacy, which was community-wide, might have affected how at 35 years that has taken to.
Right. Well, I think there are competing views of justice and equity in a situation like that. We have existing waiting lists, and while we are moving towards being less dependent on geography and more dependent relatively on the individual medical urgency of each candidate, there are people who have been put on the waiting list in certain areas who have been in line, as it were. And I likened it the other day with a colleague to getting in the short line at the movie theater, and realizing that there's a short line on this side of the theater and a long line on the other. And if the theater were to come out and say, we've decided to put you all in the same line, and we have a camera that shows what time each of you got in line, and that's the most fair, it might feel fair on paper, but to people who had been in a shorter line, that will feel like they have been passed by, and that's a legitimate feeling, and that's a real challenge to when there are not enough organs to say in the name of equity, we're gonna change the balance. People are justifiably engaged at an emotional as well as a clinical level in that conversation, and so it's a difficult conversation. And again, if all these decisions were clinical, they'd be much easier. But they are also value based, and that's why the input of the community is so important. That's why having patients at the table is so important.
Robert.
I just want to compliment you, having attended the UNOS presentation to our committee 20 years ago. The evolution is remarkable in terms of the thoughtfulness and openness and scientific rigor of what you're doing and how you presented it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mario?
Yes, I also want to thank you, Dr. Shepard, for a very informative presentation. My question is, what do we know about patients' preferences? What do we know about, their willingness to make those trade-offs, accept an organ that is of, inferior, lower quality, but that can be obtained faster? Are there surveys of patients or maybe experiments where actual patients have been proposed with alternative offers, and what have they chosen? Are there studies of this type of preferences?
I'm only aware of very limited work in this area, which doesn't mean it hasn't happened. And if committee members know of more of it, then I'd encourage you to look at that. I do think that theoretical questions of trade-offs are liable to be very different than real ones. And I think that that all of us have a tendency towards hope. And so if we can hold out for the better organ, we can still hope that it will come quickly, despite what the predictive data might tell us. And so getting the right information in front of patients and being clear and sometimes with news that is less easy to hear about what the chances are of getting a particular organ in a particular frame of time. I'm sure there has been some work done in that. I know of a little of it, but I think that we've certainly not applied enough of that to where we are now, because the range of because the system has gotten large. And again, these were one of the reasons it's taken a long time to get to some of these issues is because in a smaller system they aren't issues. In a smaller system, you don't have hundreds of offers on the same organ, and you don't necessarily get a cold time problem just getting through the offer. In a smaller system without long waiting lists in each community, it's less important whether the communities are equally balanced. And some of this we have just grown into and now need to really put our heads around for the first time.
Dennis, it looks like you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, just a brief comment. I wanted to say to Mario, sort of following on Brian's comment that maybe some committee members are familiar with work in this area. One of the priorities at CMS, especially I would say of the current CMS administrator, Seema Verma, is human-centered design. As a result of that, CMS did extensive work in the last 24 months or so to understand the thinking that kidney patients, ESRD patients go through around whether or not to get listed, and if they get listed, how they make decisions about this question that you're raising. And there is extensive work that was done as part of that human-centered design that I think is very, very revealing and gets into issues of equities and inequities as well. There's a whole, without going into a lot of detail, but just to make it clear and vivid, of kind of the nature of this. There actually are 4 different personas of patients who are on ESRD about their thinking related to transplant. And one of those personas is, I'll never get an organ. I don't have a chance. I don't have insurance. It won't happen to me. And it's just sort of like a category of a patient that just is without hope. And then there's the other end of that continuum, which is, you know, come hell or high water, I'm going to get a transplant. And here are all the things I'm going to figure out how to do to make that happen. So there are these different personas, but some really good work that's been done in that area that I think might be valuable for the committee.
Okay. Jim, was your hand up or were you just exercising? All right. Any other, we're kind of a little behind where we thought we might be. Are there any other comments or questions for Brian? I don't see any. Rebecca, are there any? All right. Well, let's go ahead and call this open session to a close.